on this list had everything they needed to be immortal. The talent was there, the songs were there, the moment was there, and then one person, one decision, one addiction, one ego. One departure pulled the whole thing apart from the inside.
You never need to doubt it. I'll make you so.
These are not stories about bad record deals or changing tastes. These are stories about what happens when the person sitting next to you in the studio is the one who ends everything. Stay until number one, because that story doesn't end with a breakup. It ends with a funeral. And 3 remaining members who never played together again. Let's get into it. 10. The Pretty Thing, Rosalind, 1964. Go back to London, 1964. The Beatles are everywhere. The Rolling Stones are starting to move. And coming up directly behind them is a band that was louder, dirtier, and by most accounts more genuinely dangerous than either of them. The Pretty Things. Rosalind was their debut single, released on Fontana Records in the spring of 1964. Written by Jimmy Duncan and Bill Farley, it was raw British R&B with a grinding guitar and a pounding beat that wasn't trying to be polished or radio-friendly. It reached number 41 on the UK charts. Not a massive chart position, but enough to establish that this band was real and that they had an energy. That cut through. Their reputation preceded them everywhere they went. Several venues banned them before they played a single note. The BBC was actively nervous about putting them on air, and that institutional resistance damaged their radio play at exactly the moment they needed exposure most. But the damage from outside was survivable. The damage from inside was not. Dick Taylor, a founding member and one of the core creative forces of the band, left early in their run. His departure pulled the original chemistry apart, just as momentum was building. Here is the context that makes that departure sting. Dick Taylor had been a founding member of the Rolling Stones before they were the Rolling Stones. That is the level of talent that walked out the door. The Pretty Things had brilliant moments after that. Their 1968 album SF Sorrow is considered one of the first true rock operas in history, years before The Who released Tommy. But the mainstream never came back for them. Rosalind got a second life in 1984 when David Bowie covered it on his Pin-Ups album. That is the version most people know. Go back and listen to the original. It bites harder. 9. The Animals. We Gotta Get Out of This Place, 1965. Get Out of This Place was not written about Vietnam. It was written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, 2 brill-building songwriters working in New York City who had never set foot in a combat zone. But when Eric Burdon sang it with that ragged, desperate vocal delivery, the song became something entirely different from what was written on the page. American soldiers in Vietnam adopted it as their unofficial anthem. It was played on Armed Forces Radio constantly. Decades later, veterans have said in interviews that this song captured exactly how they felt: trapped, desperate, and counting down the days. Bruce Springsteen has publicly called it one of the greatest rock and roll records ever made. The song came out in 1965 on MGM Records, produced by Mickey Most. It peaked at number 2 in the UK and number 13 in the US. Those chart positions do not reflect its actual cultural footprint. Now here is the detail that puts the talent level of this band in perspective. Chas Chandler, the bassist who played that descending opening bass line, one of the most recognizable bass parts in all of rock history, left the Animals within a year of this song being a hit. He walked away to discover and manage Jimi Hendrix. Let that sit. The man who helped give the Animals their sound left to launch one of the most legendary careers in the history of rock music. That tells you everything about the density of talent in that room and how much walked out when he left. Eric Burdon was the center of the band, brilliant, creative, and by accounts from multiple former colleagues, deeply difficult to work with. The Animals broke apart multiple times across different lineups. At the core of most of those breaks were conflicts between Burdon and other members over creative control, money, and direction. There were serious legal disputes over songwriting royalties that damaged relationships for years. Members have spoken in interviews about feeling consistently pushed aside and undervalued. When the Animals were firing together, they were untouchable. They never stayed together long enough to find out how far that could go. 8. Fleetwood Mac. Oh well. 1969 mid-T. You are roughly halfway through this list and the stories only get heavier from here. If you are watching this on YouTube and you are not subscribed yet, do it now. We dig into the real histories behind rock, metal, and classic music every single week, and this is exactly what the channel is built for. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Now back to it.
I can't sing, I ain't pretty, and my legs are thin, but don't ask me what I think.
When most people hear Fleetwood Mac, they think of Rumors, Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham, and the California sound of the late 1970s. That band and the band that recorded Oh Well in 1969 share a name and almost nothing else. The original Fleetwood Mac was a British blues band built around one of the most gifted guitarists who ever lived. His name was Peter Green. B.B. King once said that Green was the only white guitar player who gave him the chills. Eric Clapton admired him openly and without reservation. Oh Well came out in 1969 on Reprise Records as a two-part single. Part 1 was hard-driving blues rock built around an unforgettable guitar riff with blunt, direct, defiant lyrics. Part 2 was an almost classical acoustic instrumental. That combination in 1969 was bold and genuinely different. It hit number 2 on the UK charts and picked up serious rock radio play in the United States. Then Peter Green began to fall apart. Around 1970, he started showing signs of serious mental illness. Accounts differ on the triggers. Some point to heavy LSD use during that period. Others argue the illness was already present and substances accelerated what was coming regardless. What is documented is that his behavior became erratic and alarming. He gave away money. He pushed the band to donate all their earnings to charity. He arrived at engagements in states that frightened the people around him. Eventually, he left, and the original Fleetwood Mac dissolved with him. Peter Green spent years in very difficult circumstances, hospitalization, periods of genuine hardship far removed from the stages he had commanded. He recovered partially and returned to music later in life, but the creative force that defined that original band was never the same. Oh Well is what the original Fleetwood Mac actually was, heavier, rawer, and more honest than anything the later lineup produced. And it was built entirely on the talent of a man whose mind ultimately could not sustain the weight of what was inside it. 7. The Yardbirds, Heart Full of Soul, 1965 one band.
Deep in darkness, make you want
3 guitar players. Each one went on to define rock music for the following 3 decades. Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page. All 3 of them at different points stood in the Yardbirds. That fact alone tells you what this band was. They were not just great. They were a breeding ground for greatness, and they imploded repeatedly because of it. Heart Full of Soul came out in 1965 on Columbia Records in the UK, produced by Giorgio Gomelsky. The band had originally wanted a sitar on the track, before the Beatles made Indian instruments fashionable in rock. When the sitar player couldn't nail the part, Jeff Beck replicated the same sound using a fuzz pedal on his guitar. The result was one of the most innovative sounds in British rock up to that point. It hit number 2 in the UK and number 9 in the United States. By the time Heart Full of Soul charted, Eric Clapton had already left. He walked because he felt the band was moving too commercial. He wanted pure blues. That departure was the first structural crack. Jeff Beck stepped in as the new guitar voice of the band, and the tension between his vision and the rest of the group built steadily until it didn't. Beck quit mid-tour in the United States in 1966. Not quietly, not with notice. He walked off dramatically mid-run, leaving the band to scramble for coverage on the road. Jimmy Page, who had joined as a second guitarist with the intention of eventually shifting to bass, ended up covering lead duties out of necessity. But the chemistry was already beyond repair. The Yardbirds limped through a couple more years before Page essentially assembled the remaining pieces into a new group. That group became Led Zeppelin, which means the Yardbirds, for all the dysfunction and ego and departure, produced one final act of unintentional genius. They were the soil from which Zeppelin grew. But the real question, the one that keeps rock historians awake, is what the Yardbirds themselves could have become if Beck had stayed. If Clapton had never walked, if the ego battles had not consumed them first, that question has no answer, but it does not go away. 6. Sly and the Family Stone, Family Affair. 1971.
Dance to the music. Dance to the...
There is something almost cruel about the title given what was happening inside the band at the time. Family Affair is a slow, hypnotic, deeply soulful record about the complicated bonds that hold people together whether they choose it or not. It reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1971. Sly Stone wrote it. He played most of the instruments on it himself. That last detail is the tell. Sly and the Family Stone were one of the most genuinely revolutionary acts in American music history. Racially mixed, gender mixed, they made rock, soul, funk, and psychedelic music speak to each other in ways that had never been done before their 1969 Woodstock. Performance: Prince, Parliament Funkadelic, Living Colour, all of them owe a direct and acknowledged debt to what this group built. By 1971, Sly Stone was in serious trouble. His drug use had become severe enough to affect everything: his attendance at shows, his relationships with band members, his ability to complete projects. There are accounts of him disappearing for days at a time, arriving unreliable or not arriving at all, retreating into isolation that the people around him could not penetrate. The original members began to drift away. Rose Stone, his sister, has spoken publicly about how painful it was to watch someone she loved destroy something that beautiful. New members cycled in. The specific collective genius of the original lineup, the thing that made those early records feel like nothing else, gradually disappeared. Family Affair hit number 1 during one of the darkest internal periods this band ever experienced. A song about family reaching the top of the charts while the family itself was fracturing. That is not irony. That is just how these stories go. 5 MC5. 68.
Kick out the jams, motherfucker! Yeah!
If you have spent any time in serious rock history circles, you have heard the MC5 discussed in a specific tone of voice, reverent, slightly angry, like something was owed to them that they never received. That instinct is correct. Kick Out at Jams was recorded live at the Grande Ballroom in Detroit in October 1968 and released on Elektra Records in 1996. 9, produced by Bruce Botnick. This was not a studio recording, it was a war cry captured on tape. The energy on that record sits in a category by itself for that era. The band plays like the room is on fire and the decision has already been made. Not to evacuate. The original version of the song opens with an expletive. That single word got the record banned from major retail immediately. Hudson's, a major Detroit department store chain, refused to stock it. The band responded by taking out an advertisement that used that same word in reference to Hudson's directly. Elektra Records, horrified by the escalation, dropped them. That was the beginning of the end. The MC5 were managed by John Sinclair, founder of the White Panther Party, who believed rock music had a specific obligation to drive radical political change. Some band members were fully committed to that philosophy. Others were less certain. That internal tension between pure rock and roll energy and politically directed purpose created fractures that ran through everything. When Sinclair was sentenced to 10 years in prison for marijuana possession in 1969, the band lost the guiding structure around them. Without that, the internal conflicts between vocalist Rob Tyner and guitarist Wayne Kramer over musical direction accelerated the deterioration fast. Here is the historical weight of what was lost. The Clash named them. The Sex Pistols named them. The Ramones named them. The energy that ignited punk rock came in significant part from this Detroit band that barely registers in mainstream music history. The movement they inspired outlasted them by decades. The band itself lasted only a few years before collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. 4. The Faces, Stay With Me. 1971, Stay With Me.
Don't say you love me.
Sounds like 5 men who have known each other their entire lives playing in someone's garage with no intention of cleaning it up before you arrive. It is loose, ragged, and completely alive. Released in 1971 on Warner Brothers Records, produced by Glyn Johns, one of the genuinely great rock producers of his generation, it reached number 6 in the UK and number 17 in the United States. The Faces at their peak were considered by serious listeners to be the most exciting live band in the world. Rod Stewart on vocals, Ronnie Wood on guitar, Ronnie Lane on bass, one of the most underappreciated musical intelligences in the history of British rock. The lyrics of Stay With Me are deliberately cheeky, a one-night encounter with no promises attached. Rolled-up sleeves rock and roll, exactly what the Faces were built to deliver. The problem was Rod Stewart's solo career, which was happening simultaneously and on a different label. Every Faces record was released alongside a Rod Stewart solo record. His solo sales were outpacing the band. His name was growing larger than the band's name, and the other members, particularly Ronnie Lane, felt it in a way that became increasingly impossible to absorb. In accounts gathered over the years, Stewart increasingly treated the Faces as a secondary commitment rather than his primary one. Missed rehearsals, absent promotional obligations, a growing sense among the other members that the band was being used rather than built. Lane quit. He could not continue under those conditions. And without Lane's particular musical and emotional center, holding the rhythm section together, the Faces lost something that couldn't be replaced by personnel changes. Stewart officially left in 1975. Ronnie Wood joined the Rolling Stones. The Faces became a footnote. Ronnie Lane went on to make solo music of genuine and quiet beauty that almost no one heard. He was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in the late 1970s and spent much of the rest of his life far from the spotlight he helped build. He deserved far better than the circumstances he ended up in. Good 3, 1966.
Love you, but long as there are stars
Good
above.
Vibrations was released in October 1996, 6 on Capitol Records. Brian Wilson wrote it, produced it over 6 months, used 17 different recording studios across Los Angeles, and spent approximately $50,000 making a single song, an almost incomprehensible sum for a single record in 1966. It hit number 1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Critics called it a pocket symphony. The theremin gives the track its signature floating, outer space texture, an instrument you do not touch to play. It responds to the proximity of your hands near its antennas. Wilson used it to create a sound that didn't exist anywhere else on pop radio in 1966. He was in direct competition with the Beatles. Specifically, he was watching Sgt. Pepper being assembled and building something he believed could match or surpass it. The project was called Smile. His collaborator was lyricist Van Dyke Parks. The recordings were extraordinary, experimental, spiritual, emotionally complex, and structurally unlike anything rock music had attempted before. Then it stopped. Here is where accounts diverge, and it is important to present that clearly. Some people say Mike Love, Brian's cousin and fellow band member, pushed back hard against the direction of the album, that he found Van Dyke Parks' lyrics too abstract, too disconnected from the Beach Boys' established identity and their relationship with their audience. Mike Love, in his own interviews, has said he was trying to protect the band commercially and preserve what they had built with their fan base. Others who were present have said the pushback went further than that the studio atmosphere became hostile, that Parks was made to feel unwelcome, and that Brian Wilson, who was already navigating serious mental health struggles and increasing substance use, was in a fragile enough state that the resistance was enough to derail the entire project. What is not disputed, Van Dyke Parks left. Brian Wilson shelved Smile in 1967. He did not complete it for nearly 40 years. Brian Wilson's mental health declined significantly in the years that followed. He spent much of the late 1960s and 1970s in very dark periods. A therapist named Eugene Landy eventually became a dominant presence in his life, an arrangement that former band members and family members have spoken about with serious concern regarding the level of control involved. Brian Wilson finally released Smile in 2004 as a solo album. Critics called it a masterpiece. It was. But the world that should have received it in 1967 was long gone. Good Vibrations is not just a song. It is the entrance to a road that was never fully traveled. It is the clearest recorded proof of what Brian Wilson was capable of, and the sharpest reminder of what was lost when the people around him couldn't protect what he was building. White Room, 1968. White Room opens with a slow, heavy guitar riff and Jack Bruce's voice cutting straight through it. It sounds cinematic. It sounds like the opening of a film where everything is already about to go wrong. That is appropriate, given the circumstances. Cream were the first true supergroup in rock history by any reasonable measure. Eric Clapton on guitar, Jack Bruce on bass and lead vocals, Ginger Baker on drums, three of the most technically accomplished musicians of their generation in one room. White Room was released in 1968 on Polydor Records, produced by Felix Pappalardi, from the Wheels of Fire album, the first double album in rock history to go platinum. The song reached number 6 in the UK and number 12 in the US. The lyrics, written by Jack Bruce with poet Pete Brown, are impressionistic and dreamlike. Images of white rooms, black curtains, dark rooms, and departure. It feels like a farewell even as it plays. In many ways it was. By the time White Room was released, Cream had already decided to break up. The problem at the center of the band was Ginger Baker. Baker was one of the most technically gifted drummers who ever played rock music. He was also, by widespread and consistent account, across multiple decades from former colleagues and collaborators, extraordinarily difficult to work alongside. His history with Jack Bruce predated Cream and carried documented conflict into the band from day one. In the studio, they fought constantly about music, about direction, about everything. It is important to be precise here. Specific accounts of incidents vary depending on the source, and different people who were present tell certain moments differently. What is not in dispute is that the internal working environment of Cream was frequently hostile and emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Eric Clapton has said in his own interviews that by the end he was emotionally worn down. He has described feeling creatively trapped and personally drained by the relentless tension. Cream lasted 2.5 years. In that time they released 4 studio albums and played some of the most electrifying rock concerts on record. Their breakup in 1968 felt like a theft. The music was extraordinary. The world wanted more. The men making it simply could not continue. Clapton went on to Blind Faith, then Derek and the Dominoes, then a solo career of enormous commercial success. Jack Bruce made solo records of real quality that never found the audience they deserved. Ginger Baker continued to play and record until late in his life, never losing the enormous technical capacity that made him legendary, never entirely resolving the qualities that made him legendary trouble. 1. Led Zeppelin. Stairway to Heaven, 1971. Stairway to Heaven is the most requested song in classic rock radio history. Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Paul Jones have gone on to long careers and enduring respect. The music is beyond argument. Number 1 is not about the music. Stairway to Heaven was recorded at Headley Grange in Hampshire, England, using the Rolling Stones mobile recording unit. It appeared on Led Zeppelin in 1971, released on Atlantic Records, produced by Jimmy Page. It was never released as a single in the UK during the band's active years, a deliberate decision that made it feel more sacred than a commercial product. In the United States, it was eventually released and spent a full decade as one of the most played tracks in radio history. The song builds from a delicate acoustic opening through to one of the most explosive guitar solos in rock. Robert Plant's vocal carries it from quiet wonder at the start to raw, certain power at the end. John Paul Jones's bass and keyboard work holds the architecture of the middle sections, together with a maturity that casual listeners consistently underestimate, and when John Bonham's drums enter, they arrive like a force of nature. Many people believe, without reservation and without embarrassment, that this is the greatest rock song ever recorded. That position is not easy to argue against. Now we talk about John Bonham. John Bonham was, by near universal agreement among professional drummers, the greatest rock drummer who ever lived. His feel, his power, his swing. No one before or since has done what he did behind a drum kit. His contribution to every Led Zeppelin recording was not supplementary. It was foundational. John Bonham had a severe and escalating problem with alcohol. Over the course of the band's career, the drinking became progressively worse. There were incidents on tour, behavior that alarmed the people around him. Members of the band's road crew, in interviews given years after the fact, have spoken about the level of worry that surrounded Bonham as the years went on. By every account from people who knew him personally, he was warm, funny, and deeply loyal when sober. The alcohol was consuming him regardless. On September 24, 1980, John Bonham died at Jimmy Page's home in Windsor. He was 32 years old. The official cause was asphyxiation as a result of consuming an extreme amount of alcohol. Led Zeppelin announced their dissolution 2 months later. The statement was brief and direct. Without John Bonham, they could not continue, and they did not. The shadow over Bonham's death is not a story of malice or criminal intent. What it is, and this is the part that carries the real weight, is a long story of excess that was tolerated and managed rather than confronted, of an environment in which excess was celebrated as part of the mythology, while addiction went untreated as the emergency it was. Band manager Peter Grant and elements of the touring organization have received criticism in various accounts over the years for the culture that surrounded the band. People who were there tell this story differently from each other. Some say more could have been done and should have been done. Others say Bonham was a man who made his own choices, and no one could have redirected him. The truth is almost certainly somewhere in between those positions, complicated, painful, and without a clean resolution. What is not complicated is the result. Led Zeppelin stopped. The greatest rock band in history ended not because the music ran out, not because the audience left, not because the members grew apart creatively, but because one of them was gone. Stairway to Heaven became the final monument of a band that ended before its time. John Bonham, brilliant, irreplaceable, the single most important drummer rock music has ever produced, is gone. Nobody knew when they recorded it that Stairway to Heaven would become a farewell. That is exactly what makes it hurt as much as it soars. 10 bands, 10 songs, 10 stories about what internal destruction actually looks like when it happens to greatness. Which one hits hardest for you? Drop it in the comments, like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.